Let's play a little game of Name That Tune, shall we? Here's how it goes. It's plain to see that your brains are very small to think walking will be knocking down our walls. We'll come back to that in a second, see if you got it. One of the things that we need to be mindful of is we're in the midst of a worldwide pandemic, as we are in the midst of different challenges and opportunities in our own lives, as we're in the midst of a sermon series on how we cultivate the fruit of the kingdom for the glory of God and the benefit of the world in our lives. One of the things we need to be aware of is that Christianity isn't self-help. Christianity is not self-help. So let's talk about that for a sec. We are involved. We have a role to play in the Christian faith. Absolutely, that's true. But God also has a role to play. And our role and God's role should not be confused or conflated. We have to be careful about that. So let's talk about the book of Joshua for a minute. The book of Joshua begins, it's a story of the conquest of the promised land. And it begins with God telling his people, you know what? There's this huge river, it's flooding, and before I will stop the river and help you cross it, you have to step in. And so their part is in faith, trusting that God is going to stop this flooding river. They step in. And then God's part is that he stops the river, which is unbelievable, impossible. And then Joshua runs into the leader of the army of the Lord, and he's told how they are going to conquer the first seemingly impregnable city. And here's where Name the Tune comes in. That was VeggieTales, and it was the story of Joshua and Jericho. So do you remember that story? Do you remember how silly they must have felt? I mean, armed people, and they're literally just marching around a city. And so the VeggieTales song, the soldiers from within Jericho sing to the Israelites beneath, it's plain to see that your brains are very small to think walking will be knocking down our walls. God's part, our part. They do it. The walls fall. Jericho is all over the place. Jericho is a type in human history. When I think about abortion, I think about Jericho. When I think about evil regimes and systems of injustice throughout the world, I think Jericho. There's corporate Jerichos. When I think about the general sort of disinterest in the gospel and the barriers to communicating the gospel in Canada today, I think about Jericho. Not everywhere, but by and large, people aren't just lining up to hear the Christian message, as they sometimes do in different parts of the world and in ages past. The church in China is exploding. The church in Iran is exploding. The church here is struggling with evangelism. Jericho. We have personal Jerichos. There are things in our lives, in our past. Sometimes it's shame. Sometimes it's guilt. Sometimes it's that wrestling with anger, with impulsivity. There are deep wounds in our lives. C.S. Lewis tells us you need to try really hard to be good, to discover that you can't be good without God. God's part, our part. Very simply today, I want to remind you in the midst of this time, in the midst of a sermon series about cultivating the fruit of the kingdom, where we're rightly talking about our part, I want to remind you that we need to remember that God has a part. He is a bigger part than our part, that he's capable of immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine. Sometimes, and this is the hard work, sometimes we have to step into the river before God does what only God can do. Sometimes we look like fools as we just pray that the walls come down, as we march and sing and praise, and God brings the walls down. So I don't know how this strikes you today, but don't forget that the Christian faith is not self-help. It is not that if you just try hard enough, smart enough, long enough, that the kingdom will come. God brings the kingdom. We have a part, but so does God, and his part is bigger. God bless.